I'm Peter High, the president of Metis Strategy, book author, Forbes columnist, and your host. I'm excited to share this conversation with Hervé Coureil, the former Chief Information Officer and Chief Digital Officer, and the current Chief Governance Officer and Secretary General of Schneider Electric, a leader in sustainable energy with revenues exceeding $32 billion annually. Hervé graciously shared his thoughts on a variety of topics featured in my upcoming book, Getting to Nimble: How to Transform Your Company into a Digital Leader. The book is available for pre-order now on Amazon or through gettingtonimble.com. In this interview, we dive into several of the book's themes, including people, technology, strategy, and ecosystems. Hervé begins by sharing how Schneider Electric's business culture continues to evolve as they adopt aspects of culture from the businesses they acquire. He also discusses his process for making bets on new technologies to gain a first mover advantage, the importance of agile portfolio management, the partnerships Schneider forged to foster innovation, and a variety of other topics. Stick around after the interview to hear more about the 5 themes of Getting to Nimble, or visit gettingtonimble.com to learn more. Thank you. This interview kicked off with a discussion about Schneider Electric's company culture and Hervé's approach to evolving it over time.
I always think, when we're sort of step back and think at that, you kind of make things look slightly better than they are because you sort of intellectualize things on, when you are in the heat of the moment. It's kind of more always, of course, a little more hectic. It's not as structured as writing the history.
Exactly.
From the vantage point of a few months later or a couple of years. But if we had to think about some of the headlines, I think one of the stuff that I think is very core to the company is how we think about change and transformation, and how we think it is sort of a diffuse responsibility. I think there's something about the culture where we are probably not the most process-centric company. We're a little organic and we're kind of a little distributed. Of course, you have rules, you have guidelines, compliance, and so forth. But I think there's something strong about our culture, which is the entrepreneur, how we leave people quite a high degree of entrepreneurship, and we leave them some accountability, and we are much more looking at result. And we have a phrase actually in our, the way we describe our culture, which is empowerment over control, which I think fairly describes, not to say there's no control, of course, but we try to really leave a freedom for experimentation, which probably is a little unusual in a company of our sector, our size, etc. We know that we have some time in order to do that. You could be slightly more efficient globally if you were defining one way of doing things, and you could win a few percentage of efficiency. But we believe that being a little organic and a little distributed gives us more resilience, gives us more accountability, and gets us to a better outcome. So, I know it's kind of not particularly original to start with culture, but I think there is something in how we've built ourselves, which is that very regional culture, that very resilient, kind of organic culture where people feel highly accountable. I mean, and that's something very, very core to the culture. I think the other thing that we've tried to do is, as much as we try to keep that on the people side, that sort of highly entrepreneurial, empowered culture, we have played on other dimensions, in particular resource allocation. It kind of might look a little contradictory, but actually it's not that contradictory if you look at it. As we've looked at centralizing some investment on resource allocation decision. And the thinking was, if you let every small unit making all the investment decisions, you might get a lot of small bets, but you may have a problem that none of those bets might be big enough so that they really make a dent, right? So you might be dispersed in a lot of different areas. So and we're by far, not doing it perfectly or whatever, but we've sort of done a culture of a strategic cycle where we look at the bets that we want to take as an organization, and we kind of counterbalance the entrepreneurship with a fairly disciplined approach in resource allocation and investment decisions, right? So that yes, we have small teams. Yes, we have people who, are able to make a lot of decisions on the field as to what they think is right. But at the same time, we counterbalance that with that very disciplined resource allocation process that is fairly centralized. So if we decide this is a bet, this is a bet. And I think that has explained the traction we had on digital, for instance, because you had that mix of, people on the ground making quick, fast-paced decision, adapting quickly, didn't have to go through 5 layers of corporate approval to get something going. But at the same time, we had allocated sufficient amount of money so that we could make a dent, right? And we could really do things that are material. I think a third aspect, more on the technology side, is we've tried to, again, because everything sort of starts with a culture, right? So due to the culture, we try to have an approach to technology that's more, we try to use our central technology units to be sort of ahead of the game and say, hey, we should never have a situation where an operating unit comes to the center and asks for something. Because if they ask for something, it's already too late. You have to build it. It means you're not ready. You're going to move not as fast as, all the super nimble, super agile startups, smaller companies, whatever. So I think you need to counterbalance the scale of a company with the ability to make bets and to make bets that are sort of see what's ahead and try to identify the bets that are working for you before they become mainstream. So we've tried to really leverage the cloud. We try to leverage API. We try to leverage product versus project sort of approach. And I really believe in the value of being explicit. We try to be fairly disciplined in either having a first mover advantage or a last mover advantage. Either we invest early or we say, no, it's not critical. We'd better use that particular technology, later on when it's price, etc., because it's not core for us. It's good, but it's not being critical. And you can't do everything, right? If you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing. So we try to apply that lens also to our technology choices, being fairly trying to be sharp on explicit in our choices. And you say, okay, we're not going to make that many bets, but we're going to make a few. We're going to make bet early, and we'll try either to be very early, to be kind of a, mature adopter, but we'll avoid that middle frenzy curve when everybody goes, things are expensive, you are in the middle of a heat, and kind of it's very difficult to have an edge because everything is doing the same thing, right? So you still experience some of the early scars, but you're not really ahead, and you don't have a benefit from technological maturity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also how we look at technology and trying to have that idea of where is it that, technology that can move the needle for us on sort of taking advantage of our size so that we can start building things even before there's a demand. And that goes in how we build platforms. I think we have a fairly specific approach at platforms. 2 or 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, when IoT platform was a thing and everybody wanted an IoT platform, etc., you had many companies that, tried to build their own flavor of the IoT platform, and then you have a lot of flavors of IoT platforms on the market. The way we've tried to approach that was to say, we don't think that anybody in a B2B, fairly rational buyer B2B world, nobody wants to build a platform because they want a platform. People have a problem to solve. They want to solve that problem. They might solve it through a platform, but it's kind of a means to an end. We try to look at technology through the lens of which problems are we trying to solve. So we formed, actually, when we built our IoT platform, because we have one, but we, in the context of EcoStruxure, which you know well, but we built it with a service team, with a kind of an internal professional service team, We built it as an internal product, and we set a few rules. A, we're never going to compete with our own businesses, so we might open it, but Two, we're never going to have technology-centric discussions, so we're going to create our own road mapping capabilities, our own kind of lean startup methodology and sort of design thinking approach, if you will, where we work with our businesses, we define with them how the kind of customer problem we're trying to solve using an IoT platform, and then from that we derive what capabilities we need. And the roadmap was a second order evolution from those design thinking process. And we've tried to do that so that we sort of abstract to some extent technology conversations from the business conversation. And we try really to have business conversation first, bringing customers around the table and so forth. And in a second step saying, okay, and then if you do that, you realize you rarely need some of the shiniest technology, because many use cases, you can actually get there with good proven technologies, and some super complex. Then you say, okay, now we might have an edge if we invest there, but you understand why you're doing, you understand what you're after, and so forth. So we've been very considered in the use of technology, how we approach a platform, and we try to never sort of put technology first, but always technology at a service of business conversations, right? And that has been a very, very key feature in how we've built. So we ended up actually, we've never really marketed, if you will, ourselves as a platform. We say, no, it's on there was a platform, but we rather say, no, we have a portfolio of solutions. On those portfolio of solutions, of course, because scale matter, because, security matter, because you want to do things in a way that are extensible and so forth. They rely on common technologies on an IoT platform in the back end, but the priority was not selling a platform. The priority was solving actual customer problems. So, kind of long answer, but that's probably the freelance of people, resource allocation, and sort of technology, that I think are sort of heavily woven together.
That's a great overview. Thank you, Hervé. I want to return to a few of the points, beginning with culture. So the way you described it, it sounds as though Schneider Electric really has a culture that embraces change, which is contrary to human nature at a minimum. And I wonder, moreover, I think it's important to note that this is really in many ways the difference maker between those organizations that were once great but faded away versus those that were great and remain great. They have this ability to change and recognize that past success doesn't preordain future success. Talk a bit about how this orientation seeped into the culture of your organization.
I think it's a bit of course, leadership. I mean, we have a CEO that, look at what can. So he is a very unsatisfied person at the core. I mean, he's a bar raiser, right? Which I think is a great leadership attribute, and it kind of translates to the entire leadership team, right? So it's not the kind of company where you're going to hear, okay, we're all good now. No, right? If we do something, we're going to look at the next one and so forth. So there's in the leadership value, how people are evaluated and how they are promoted, etc. There is this kind of discontent with the status quo, and that I think is something kind of unwritten, but I think that is fairly pervasive. I mean, it is hard to be promoted in the executive committee of Schneider if you're not fundamentally unhappy with the status quo, if you don't want to change it. So there's something very much into the fabric of our leadership structure. And the other thing that I would add is that we're a company that grew up through a lot of acquisitions. I mean, our size increased tremendously over years. So we always had to bring on new culture. I mean, integrate new companies, and that has always questioned us. I mean, when you make a very significant acquisition, you realize, oh, they're doing things different than us. We might do that better than us. So then, you want to pick that up. And when we integrate company, we don't come with that sort of massive approach where suddenly we paint everything and the next day, they've lost their identity. We try to be a little more gentle in the way we acquire a company. We try to understand, to benchmark, see what's good, on get inspiration also, on sort of import, not just export, but import what makes sense to us. So I think the fact that we grew significantly via acquisition helped us question ourselves at various levels, not just the leadership. And I think created that idea that, wow, you're never finished because, you may work on that fancy IT system, but next year we're going to acquire that company and then you're back to square one. So I think those are two of, maybe explanations, right, behind that approach.
That's interesting. I also want to ask you, you talked about this move from a project orientation to a product orientation, and this is really something we're seeing a great deal of late as well. And the ramifications of what that means for organizations, the team makeup that is different under product, a way of framing activities as well. Talk a bit about how you think about that and the evolution that your organization has been through as part of this migration.
So it's probably the latest big transformation we've embarked the technology teams on, right? Was to say, okay, I mean, Agile is nice, but you need to put Agile in context. I think especially actually in large companies like ours, you can look at a lot of IT capabilities really like a product and stop thinking about a project with a beginning and the end, because you'll never get the end, especially in our context. We'll have acquired one more company, one more thing, one more change, etc. So stop thinking with a finite mindset. You need to sort of change the mindset and take on board some of all the good concept that came with Scrum and Agile, like if you build it, we run it, and if you build it, you run it, and all those things, and say, okay, we're going to rethink the way we deliver internal capabilities by saying there might be 15 to 20 sort of macro capabilities we deliver, and they're going to have all their roadmap, and there's somebody who's going to be a mini CIO of sorts that will have that capability, will have to look at their roadmap, look at their interdependencies, look at the features that they develop, how they simplify the architecture, on how they deliver that capabilities on, and the sort of end result, right, from a business standpoint. So how you have success metrics that sort of proves that you are successful in the end. So this has been a lot of thinking, and we've, like many large companies, we suffered of the mega projects that are super difficult to manage, are full of interdependencies, and quite frankly, you never manage to finish because there's always something more. And we felt that the product mindset made a lot of sense, making people accountable. In particular, if you have sort of your internal professional service approach, where you say the same way you do, in every technology company, you don't have your product people absorbing every single customer request. You also have a professional service teams that's going to interface with, this time your internal stakeholders, take it on board, translate, and then provide relevant information to the product team that will work on their roadmap and so forth. So I think you really need to go all the way. And we started through that approach through the common bricks, right? So for instance, we said a few years ago, we should have one single sign-on in Schneider. If you're a customer, doesn't matter, you have one ID, and then, how we can personalize what you see. So this was one of our first product bricks, right? Where we really thought about it as a product, agile, sprints, 6-week sprints, etc. And now, so we've developed more and more of those products now, HR systems, we think about them like that and so forth. So there's this progressive evolution where we started by what was more transversal because it had more interdependency, and the product mindset gave us probably a better framework to deal with those interdependencies. And now we're trying progressively to deploy that mindset towards more capability inside our enterprise systems.
You talked a bit about Agile and the changes that have been happening relative to that and its implementation. Talk a bit about how that's been implemented and evolved across Schneider Electric.
Agile is it's a great methodology, but the thing is that, you can paint almost anything as Agile. I've seen more than one person. Yeah, we run Agile, and the first thing they show you is a waterfall chart with a Gantt chart, and say, "Oh, I'm not too sure." So I think it's important to say, if you're really Agile, it's not just, you just don't declare yourself Agile. You have to rethink how you manage your portfolio. You have to rethink how you spend and how you control your spending. You have to rethink how you make recruitment decisions. You have to rethink how you prioritize, roadmap versus project approach and so forth. So I think it makes sure that we just don't paint a layer of Agile, it's not just a brush, brushing some Agile color on top of something that we have not changed at the core, but that we really change the way we operate at the very core. And I think it's a way to make sure that Agile transformation is not superficial, but becomes a real evolution of our operating model.
You also talked a bit about APIs, and I want to go back to that. How and where have you determined best to leverage APIs? What are the parts of your tech landscape that seem most appropriate to focus those on?
So we've been developing a reference architecture internally, where we try, and of course that's something that takes a lot of time to progress. You don't just it doesn't happen overnight. But we've managed to progressively implement a reference architecture inside Schneider, where we say, okay, this is going to be the data layer, the logic layer, and then the exposure layer, and then the user interface layer. And we try to do a huge mindset shift, which is whenever you are coming with a new feature, you don't try to create a UI that goes with that feature. You try to deliver logic through an API that then can be picked up by a UI team that will, do whatever has to be done with that particular logic. So we've tried really, there's a very good actually Twitter thread, you may have seen it recently, about the narrow waist internet on the internet protocol, which I think is really spot on about how interfaces are very critical in every complex architecture. And I think for long we've underestimated how important it is. So we're really trying to sort of say, at the end of the day, you have UI, you have logic, you have data layer, and then you have your interface. And if you sort of manage to articulate those 4 building blocks in a smart way, we're good. And we can, because we have uncoupled a lot of dependencies. On uncoupling is the only way to go fast. So I think it's, and of course, AWS, as the guys at AWS have really been forward looking with their approach, right? An API first approach, and on not trying how they've sort of build a system that doesn't rely on or very, very little on interdependency management, right? You just go build it, etc. So we've tried in our own way to get some inspiration out of that, and say, have a team that's really in our CTO team that's fully dedicated to API. It's a product by itself. API marketplace. We look at internal exposure, external exposure, documentation, and we try really to bring up the level of professionalism, but do that in a context of that reference architecture where you disconnect feature from UI, and you try to develop headless features that then can be integrated in the relevant UI, whether it's a mobile UI, voice UI, web UI, whatever that is, right? So it's we're at the very beginning of that, but we see it as a pretty exciting change. On everything that can break down interdependencies, everything that allows us to remove a system change from the critical path is welcome, because it means we can go faster. So we always have that logic, what's your bottleneck, what's your critical path, and can we unbundle things so that you don't have to on a lot of the work we did on at the very beginning on actually resource allocation was all thinking about that, right? How do we develop new things that don't depend on our bottlenecks to really be deployed, which means that at some point you're going to duplicate stuff. It might be not the most optimal, but you have to trade speed with efficiency at some point.
You also mentioned resource allocation as an area of importance and something that's been a strategic weapon for the organization. I'd love to hear more about how that is the case and how it's been a difference maker for you.
So a few years ago, it was really a project-based resource allocation where we say, okay, mobile is coming, voice is, how do we make sure we mobilize enough resource on architecture, etc., to develop something new? The way it's evolving through agile product mindset, etc., is not so much. We do it at a less granular level now. I mean, if you have very good people in charge of all your bricks and all your products, it's going to be much more which are the products that need more investment on, and then you start at a global level, be less granular in how you allocate resource, because you're going to allocate resource down to technology bricks on technology products, and then you let the product sort of run it the next level down because they know what's in their roadmap. Yeah, they know better than anybody else. So that's sort of how we approach that, right? Is we try to have that dual approach where we started quite granular on resource allocation, and I think we're progressively moving as we implement new products to sort of devolve resource allocation accountability to the global product leaders and leave them more decisions. Because also, we've also the level of product of our product leaders now is much higher than level of people we had maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So of course, by definition, if you hire great people, you have to give them the accountability, freedom, and the resources that go with it. I think we still keep a very high level of visibility. We still keep that ability of saying, yes, we really want to work on that, and that's going to be done through this product, etc. But we do it more at a slightly more higher level now that we are migrating to a product mindset, and we try to leave more accountability to the product leaders.
We talked about culture a short while ago, Hervé, and I know that culturally speaking, yours is also an innovative culture and one that is very willing to experiment and take risks. But you also talk about the need for a direction for that the organization can't simply meander aimlessly looking for areas to innovate, that it's important to have an area of focus and that the strategic planning process be geared towards pointing in certain directions where the organization might focus. Talk a little bit further about the way in which you and the team operate in that model.
It's interesting because in a good Schneider way, I don't think we have a super formal. I mean, we have a strategic planning, 3-year plan, whatever, etc., that we do every year, and that's a pretty good exercise. When it comes to technology, I don't think it is that formalized. I think we are trying to be super connected, of course, with what's happening. Super connected with VCs, with startups. We try to have a lot of antennas. We have our venture arm. We happen sometimes to invest in startup. We're gonna usually make a small bet, assess, repeat, and then if we really see something emerging, we're gonna keep an eye. I mean, as I mentioned, we want to be ahead of the game, so we try to either be late or early. So we try to be fairly, very explicit, but it's not in the context of, a planning exercise that starts in March and then until May we screen and then, you go again. It's kind of a permanent thing. And we're having with the innovation team, quarterly meetings, go in the detail, thinking, etc., and trying to assess what are the bets. If we are also things that are super technologies that are highly transversal, what we usually would do is ask one of our product leaders to experiment, right? So we would try to experiment in one part of a company or one line of business, and then learn, etc. So it's a kind of a continuous thing. On the stuff also that we try to do, which is always difficult, is to make sure that everybody feels that, this sense of innovation, looking outside, is part of their mandate. I mean, we want to avoid the situation where the technology organization is just around don't think, execute, and then you have a few dreamers on the side. Usually that doesn't work very well. So we try to push when we do reviews. We try also to put, and again, not just innovation in vacuum, but say, okay, what new have you tested? What have you tried to do differently? What are, emerging technologies or companies you've been working with, etc. It's not the most difficult aspect, I have to say, because we tend to have people that are ever hungry for external ideas. They love to experiment. So sometimes we even have to maybe calm down the enthusiasm and making sure that, we still also do what's mainstream. But there is, that spirit of making sure that innovation doesn't stay at the edge, but you can infuse it in the core, and you have all those incubation processes, etc., to make sure that you really pick it up on pretty fast.
I know that you're an executive who thinks a lot about the building of ecosystems. You talked about venture capitalists and other external sources of insight that you leverage. I'd love to hear a bit more about that, about the way in which you seek insight from partners of yours outside of the organization.
So there's probably 3 or 4 different aspects to that. I mean, of course, we have a huge advantage of being in Boston, not too far from MIT. We do spend time with academic institutions in general, sponsoring some research, working in some consortium, working in some academic centers. So, the Initiative for Digital Economy, for instance, at MIT, or CISA at MIT, are areas which are good ways of, stepping back, thinking, etc. So we've really leveraged our relationship there. There's also in the Boston area very interesting incubators. I don't know if you heard about Greentown Lab. It's a clean tech incubator it's a huge one actually. They're in Somerville, and again we have pretty good relationship there. So it helps us, still getting this nervous system where you feel what's going on. So I mentioned VC. I mean, I try myself to keep a good relationship with VC, discuss with them, share notes, etc. But some of the large VCs, of course, are super forward looking in terms of what's going on. And I say the 4th big thing is our large partners. I mean, we value, the relationship with AWS and with Microsoft is really impressive. Microsoft, I mean, the change in Microsoft are also quite amazing. So I think we also try to get inspiration, the very large tech partners.
You talked about the different cloud partners that you use, AWS, Microsoft, among others. I'd be interested in your thoughts about the cloud as a source of nimbleness, and also the degree to which you believe the penetration of the cloud, that is the use of cloud across the technology landscape, what's appropriate, at least within your mind.
Oh, for us, if there's one good bet that we did was to be early on the cloud, because, it allowed us to free a lot of resource. I mean, leadership resource, technology resource, financial resource in doing other things that were more core to the mission. So we've tried to be very at the forefront of a cloud transformation. We feel it's a huge game changer in terms of scale. Of course, all the good things that we all know, right? Scalability and how quickly you can ramp up resource. And I think there's something that is kind of, when you take cloud API, etc., something that is kind of understated sometimes when we speak about how it helps us to connect across different organizations. I mean, if cloud helps you to connect with your ecosystem in a way that much more nimble than what it used to be only a few years ago, when you had to drill a hole through your firewalls and so forth, right? So there's a whole evolution of cloud networking technology that allows us not to have a trade-off between cloud and security, but have both, as it should be, and therefore being able to expand to your ecosystem much more quickly. And I think that's absolutely, one of the core value for us. I mean, if you're going through M&A, I mean, if you have a heavily cloudified environment, it is much easier to connect a new entity that has been acquired recently. So I think this connectivity value, which is at the juncture of cloud and network tech, is a huge driver for us. We really believe in cloud technology. We believe at cloud on edge. We think that, especially in the industrial world, I think there's a place for both. I mean, if you look at, industrial environment, you still need deterministic real time. You can't have any latency. You can't have any network dependencies. So I think that we see a very interesting evolution of the entire stack, actually, of cloud and edge with very different functional points. Usually your control systems being at the edge, and then more your analytics and benchmarking and performance layer being on the cloud, and all those ideas also that have progressed tremendously on how you train a machine learning model on the cloud, and then you infer on the edge so that you do it right away, and you create the right abilities so that you can train your model even faster with what has been inferred on the edge. So I think there's a lot of interesting evolutions there around cloud and edge, and I think that's really the new, sort of one of a new platform. And networking technologies have evolved a lot also too. They're kind of the unsung hero in my view, because they've evolved a lot in helping us achieve that vision.
Interesting. You talked a bit about security and obviously the sanctity of security for any organization, and frankly the fact that during these times it's becoming only more complex. In an environment where the threat landscape has disseminated so dramatically, where tech trends like IoT, just to name one, for instance, again continues to expand the threat landscape. Talk a bit about the way in which you have thought about ensuring that yours is an organization that is secure.
So it indeed has evolved quite a fair bit. I think the main thing is, cloud was probably the first big move that kind of got us away from the traditional perimeter vision of security, right? Where you have big walls and you retreat in your castle behind big walls, etc. I mean, it's not possible anymore. Of course, maybe in some super specialized, this kind of activities, maybe you still do that. But in many of the other cases, right, you need to work with your ecosystems, whether they're partners, whether they're customers, and you can't just rely on a perimeter, on having thick walls. So I think from that perspective, the NIST framework, that has been developed by the Department of Commerce is a huge way to think about it in depth, where you look really through all the steps, right? Detect, and up to recover. And I think that's really the mindset we've tried to take. It's to try to have an in-depth approach to security as opposed to a perimetric approach. We try really to say, hey, sometimes we kind of oppose things that should not be opposed. We feel that IoT, we feel that the cloud are a way to absorb much more information. So you're able to understand what's going on much better than before. So actually, it should not go against your security position. It should improve it, because you are able to see much more and to analyze much more and to react much more quickly. So if you're in an approach where, you believe you don't just rely on walls, but you have radars and you look at what's going on and you correlate, you create that capability of reacting super quickly. We don't oppose technology and cloud, etc. I mean, even, COVID-19 meant that so many people are working from home. So goodbye perimeter, on for a while. So I think all those zero trust concepts, all new network security concepts I think are going to get a lot of traction very, very quickly, because they just enable the way we do business now.
Good points. Very, very good point. I want to also talk about enterprise architecture as a means of getting your arms around the technology portfolio, understanding what you have under your control, the interconnections that have been built across those, and as a means of helping shape and evolve, and also recognize how the decisions that you make impact the broader tech landscape you already have in place.
No, absolutely. We think it's actually, enterprise architecture is even more important than ever, because actually the data virtualization, API, containers, all the new ways you think about logic, right? All the way you think that UI now means that you need to think more and more at a component level. So it's like not architecture inside the building, but you're looking at the architecture of the entire city. And that's where enterprise architecture is even more important. And that component level thinking, right? I mean, in real world, of course, you need to think inside the component and outside the component. But I mean, if I had to prioritize something, looking at your architecture at a component level, at the enterprise level, it's a good way to ensure that you don't create bottlenecks, that you don't create critical paths, that you're going to be dependent upon in the future. So the good thing with enterprise architecture is you realize that you have different functions of scale, right? I mean, in a traditional way, scale means size, which of course, in a way, scales mean size. But I think if you think about it from an enterprise architecture standpoint, scales means often replicability. And scale means your ability to efficiently replicate something that works well somewhere. And I'm always pushing the enterprise architect to think about those two dimensions of scale. And I think there's a traditional model of centralized scales, build something unique and super efficient, etc. But you have a more distributed version of scale that goes with high replicability, which I think a good thinking of enterprise architecture allows you to at least conceptualize and aim at.
Related to that, I wanted to talk to you a bit about the retirement of old systems. A lot of companies are great at introducing the new and are not as comfortable with eliminating the old when the new, in fact, is rendering the old redundant. Talk a bit about how you think about that process and ensure that your tech landscape isn't simply creating greater redundancy and greater complexity at the same time by retiring old systems.
Yeah, so it goes now. It's one of the things that we used to do more centralized, that the product approach that we are discussing before allows you to do more at a decentralized level, at the level of each product. So progressively now, each product are in charge of their own landscape, right? So we have a pretty traditional 4-tier, right? Look at application from the latest to the obsolescent, and then it's the role of each. It becomes one of the accountability of the product owners actually to look at the estate, to look at the landscape, and create the obsolescence management approach that works for them. And we've learned that it's actually fairly different from an area to another. So it does make sense to let your product owners have a say in that and define what's the best way to approach. The thing that we care about at a global level is visibility. So we have a super clear now vision of all of our application. We know the age. We have a sort of a computer kind of coefficient of obsolescence. So we have some rules as to, okay, if it's obsolescence after 2 years, it needs to go. So we've kind of defined some rule-based high-level principle, but really progressively our idea is rather to let the product owner go with it and implement and work on the tactic, right? And then the role of the central is much more giving the framework on the set of the principle set.
Well, what a great overview. Hervé Coureil, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great conversation to understand the way in which you, as a leader, have and your teams have managed a remarkable organization through complex times. And I appreciate you sharing great insights from across Schneider Electric's evolution.
Thank you, Peter.
This interview featured insights that you'll find in my upcoming book, Getting to Nimble: How to Transform Your Company into a Digital Leader. In an era of unprecedented technology, progress, and disruption, it's imperative that companies transform themselves to keep up with their digitally native competitors. In Getting to Nimble, I explore how companies, including Capital One, FedEx, CarMax, Domino's Pizza, The Washington Post, Walmart, and others, have modernized their practices related to people, processes, technology, ecosystems, and strategy. And I provide a framework for companies looking to do the same. To learn more, visit gettingtonimble.com.